Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard and another edition of Utterly Pointless Comparisons. Now if you found your way to this channel through the recent Odroid Go Advanced videos, don't worry, I've got another one of those coming as well. Instead of doing one video this week, I'm going to do two, so in a couple of days I'll have a tutorial up on how to install an operating system and transfer games to prepare them for use on your Odroid Go Advance. Today I'm going to be comparing the arcade and Genesis versions of Technos' smash hit, Double Dragon. Double Dragon may not have been the first scrolling beat-em-up chronologically speaking, but it was unquestionably the first major breakout hit of the genre. So let me go ahead and put up the specs of the arcade hardware along with the Genesis hardware, so you can look at those while I talk a little bit more about the game. The original arcade version of Double Dragon was released by Technos in July of 1987. It was a huge hit back in its day, and deservedly so. It looked, sounded, and played great. Now, as with many major hits back in the day, it was ported to several home systems and computers. The version we're looking at today is the one that came to us from Accolade's Ballistic label for the Sega Genesis. The Genesis version of Double Dragon was released in 1992, and is notable for a few reasons. The first of which is it came out so long after the arcade game was released. And then the second major thing it's notable for is it's one of the few major unlicensed third-party releases for the system. Another thing to keep in mind while you're watching this video is that the Genesis version of Double Dragon came out earlier in the same year that Streets of Rage 2 was released. Now I'm going to do things slightly differently for this video. During the actual comparison portion, I'm going to narrate some things instead of putting the text on the screen. If you prefer the text or prefer the narration, either way, go ahead and jump in the comments and let me know. It might influence how I handle these videos in the future. As far as recording methodology goes this time around, nothing fancy, I just played the games all the way through and recorded. Make comparison go, now! To start with, the higher resolution of the Genesis version is apparent. Here is also one of gaming's earliest panty shots. There's some nice shading in the Genesis version compared to the arcade original, despite it having smaller total and on-screen palettes. You'll notice the arcade version runs in a near constant state of slowdown. The Genesis version is faster, but it's actually too fast. Both versions feature two-player simultaneous play, which we don't see here. One quick gameplay note, the Genesis version doesn't always register button presses for punches and kicks, which can be really frustrating. That's not an emulation issue, it happens on the real system as well. Another thing you don't see here is the punch combo followed by the uppercut. The uppercut on the Genesis version is smaller and closer to your body and doesn't connect nearly as often. Plus, it looks really dumb. Your ears do not deceive you. The Genesis version sounds considerably worse than the arcade version. Like a lot of Western-developed Genesis games, they just couldn't come to grips with the Genesis' sound hardware. Hello, wrong color Abobo! Hello, wrong head Abobo! In the arcade version, you can kick the oil drums, boxes, and boulders, but not in the Genesis or most other home versions. Also, check out how huge the cat is sitting on the garbage can in the arcade version. They brought him down to a more reasonable size for the Genesis game. This song is awesome in the arcade version and absolute garbage on the Genesis. Let's just chuck a few of these guys down that pit. This level is super short in both versions of the game. There's some interesting background and color changes on the Genesis port. You'll notice the boss in the Genesis version is a straight-up palette swap of Billy and Jimmy. They didn't even bother changing the head. Also, his moveset is a little bit different. One more big difference you may not have noticed is that in the arcade version of Double Dragon, every time you knock an enemy down, it takes them longer to get up, and they keep getting up slower and slower until they finally die. This doesn't happen in the Genesis or any other version of the game to my knowledge. In the other version, every enemy lays on the ground after you knock them out for a set amount of time before they get up. Youch! The Genesis version of this level is hard to look at. That floor pattern is just way too busy. This level has tolerable music on Genesis, but still doesn't sound nearly as good as the arcade game. Down the hole with you! some reason, lots of people had trouble making the jump over the bridge back in the day. Wrong color abobos again on Genesis. The background pattern on the Genesis is kinda weird here again. And we have our simple Billy and Jimmy palette swaps. Also note that they don't break your grab on the Genesis, and on the Genesis you can knee enemies fewer times than the arcade from a grab, and also it doesn't hurt them as much. And more wrong color and wrong head abobo fun. Once again, we can kick the rocks on the arcade version, but not on the Genesis. Well, they took the moving bricks out of the Genesis version. Bad for authenticity, but great for the nerves. Hey, we almost have the right abobos here! Oh, goodness. What have you done, Accolade? The final room is tiny on the Genesis port compared to the arcade one. There are fewer enemies, and the worst sin of all. In the arcade Double Dragon, we get the absolutely awesome Double Dragon theme song. On the Genesis, they just play the regular old boss music. Here comes Marion. Now, I'm woke and all that, but oh boy, that Marion face in the Genesis version. Also, Marion on the Genesis needs to buy a dress she fits into. Look at the amount of panty in that shot. Alright, thanks for sticking around to the end. So a lot of the corners that were cut in the Genesis version of Double Dragon had to do with the very meager 512 kilobyte cartridge size that Accolade decided to use. This led to some missing animation frames, some altered ones, and also it removed the multiple various heads that were put on different bodies of the same characters in the arcade one. What I mean by that is there were various Bobos that had goatees or mohawks, and all those are completely absent in the Genesis version. There are two things that I think share top billing for equal disappointment in the Genesis game, unfortunately. The first one is the controls. Sometimes it just misses your punch and kick button presses. You might press them over and over, and it skips a few every now and then. It's the only beat-em-up game I've played on the system that does this. And this is not an emulation issue. This happens on real, actual hardware. The other thing that to me is equally disappointing is just how badly they butchered the absolutely amazing soundtrack this game has. The Genesis sound hardware is capable of so much better than what we got here. But this was kind of typical for Western third-party developed games on the Genesis. So sadly we got stuck with this, but you know, when you look at something like Midnight Resistance that actually sounds better than the arcade game, you have to wonder how something like this could happen. And now another video draws to a close, my friends. Which version of Double Dragon did you find better or more interesting? Is there some weird comparison you'd like to point out that I didn't talk about during the video? Go ahead and leave a comment below. With that, I will say thanks for watching, and see me later.